Hi everyone, I just played a tournament. Tournament details in the description below, and I am very proud of this game. I think I really turned a good position into a great one. So let me show you. I started off with e4, and after e5, I like to go for the Italian game. I really enjoy it, and after the Gyoko piano, if you want to be fancy, after bishop c5, I like to go for this gambit line with c3 and d4, an immediate c3 and d4. After knight f6, some people go d3, do pianissimo, but I just go for d4, the center attack, the Greco gambit, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what the name is. Just giving up a pawn because after pawn takes and pawn takes, the bishop checks, and now I block with the knight. There's other moves too in this position. Bishop d2 is a move, knight c3 is a move, and there's a lot of theory in all of them. I opt for knight bd2. So he could take this pawn if he wants to. This is just a free pawn, but white does get compensation because now they win time with the move d5, and so white will always have more space, and oftentimes they win the bishop pair for their troubles, or they just have a massive lead in development, either way. Okay, so, but he does not take the free pawn. Instead, he plays d6. I've played against d5 a lot, and this d5 is very interesting, declining the gambit and giving white an isolated queen's pawn, an IQP. This is a pretty challenging way to play. I think this is the most critical way to play, in my opinion. At least I've had trouble playing against this in the past. But white is totally fine here if they do play d5. But d6 is pretty inferior because now I can go d5. And actually, if you move your knight immediately, I've actually had this in an over-the-board game, I just win the bishop with a check. This knight was guarding the bishop, but now the knight moves, and you just lose the bishop. So you actually have to take the knight with check, so you have to give up the bishop pair. And white is just slightly better because they have more space in the center, and they have the bishop pair. And my opponent, he goes knight e5, and I just take. I don't think there's any reason not to take. And like sometimes this pawn can be weak, especially if they can get pieces behind it, in front of the pawn, targeting it. But by taking, I actually put his own pawn in front of my potentially weak pawn, and also now I can go f3 to get connect 4 if I push to f3, and also just have a really, really solid, strong pawn chain. So this trade really benefits me, I think. I actually wonder here if knight e7 is better. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not sure. Maybe it gets a bit dicey. No, I think it's totally fine to play knight e7 instead of knight e5. Anyways, but he does opt for knight e5. And after the trade, this pawn is hanging. I actually thought for a few minutes here because, well, I wasn't sure if I should just castle, giving up this pawn, still game-winning pawns. But after rook e1, I was like, okay, well, now he has to move his knight. He could, like, take my bishop, but I win my pawn back, and this looks okay. He could go bishop f5, but then f3. And I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, I think I do always win the pawn, but I wasn't sure. Like, this tournament is game in 45, delay 5, so I didn't want to spend a long time calculating it. He could also go f5, but I still go here. And this is probably still good for me because he can never block, so he has to move his king. So, but I thought, he probably won't take the pawn. He probably just castle. And then now I have to defend the pawn now because now he's not hanging with this e5 pawn is not hanging with check anymore. Like, for example, if I don't defend the pawn, he could take, and this is no longer a check. So I thought here for a second about castling and just allowing him to take on e4 because that wouldn't be good for him. But I was like, you know what? Let's just defend the pawn. Like, he's not going to take the pawn anyways. Might as well just defend it. And I think my queen wants to be on the c file anyways, so I can put a rook and a queen here and and target the c pawn, and but probably castling might be better or just equally good. I'm not sure. I do end up going queen c2, and he castles, and I castle, and he goes for an immediate c6, which makes sense because it's not really clear what else black does. Just because this extra space for white is just so nice. Like bishop d7, like what are you doing? Like how are you going to get like maybe rook c8 and then c6? So maybe he could have spent more time preparing the move c6 to get a better version of it. That would be kind of interesting. I'm not sure how white deals with that. For example, if rook c1, rook c8, it actually feels like black is getting in c6 in a good way. So maybe this is what he should have done. Although I'm sure I can play very differently if he did go bishop d7. I'm not really sure. Like maybe f3 and bishop e3 immediately. Not too sure. But instead he goes for immediate c6, and I just get, and here I actually was thinking about bishop g5 for a bit. Wasn't really sure, because well, firstly this pawn is hanging. So if I do nothing, he's going to take, and then take again. So this pawn is indeed hanging. So bishop g5 is one of the ways to address it, because if he takes, well, he can't take with the knight because it's pinned. And I thought about this, but I was like, after h6, do I really want to take the knight? I mean, I thought this was still good for me. Something like this, and if he ever takes, I mean, this is a good position for me, for sure. I just didn't think it was particularly anything special. And then if I don't take, I'm like, is this position that good for me? Like, I'm not really sure. Especially compared to what I did in the actual game. Like, compare this position to what happened in the actual game. Well, also, another thing here, I guess his king is very wide open, and I think most people would be very happy here with white. But of course, he doesn't have to go h6 and g5. So I invite a lot of complications, or I have to calculate more to make sure this is okay. If I do go bishop g5. And also, what I did in the game was I just took. I mean, this looks pretty fine. I'm setting up a discovered attack, hitting the queen, and attacking the rook at the same time. And I just felt this position was very, very solid, and he always has this weakness. And even though this is not an isolated pawn, this e5 pawn, it feels like an isolated pawn because the f7 pawn is pinned, and he can never go f6. Like, I can go f3 and have my pawns all nicely guarded, but he can never go f6. So these pawns are weak. I have the bishop pair. I have more activity. So it just felt like the right move to just take the pawn. Although objectively, maybe bishop g5 was better. I'm not too sure. He goes queen c7 to just sidestep. Just sidestepping any discovered attacks. And I was going to end up going f3. I'm not sure where I want my bishop yet. Do I want my bishop on g5? Do I want my bishop on e3? If I go to e3, then maybe a knight g4. Maybe not. It does allow my bishop to go here, for example. I was thinking about that, but I decided to go f3, and I thought this was a good move. He could go check me again, or he could go move his queen again to check me. I don't really think that does anything, though. And my pawn chain is so beautiful. And I still have very clear plans for my pieces. I want to move my bishop out here, or here, or here, or here. And it's just double my rooks. So I have very, very easy moves in this position. And so instead of, so I do play f3, and he goes bishop b7, which was like, he's overprotecting his c6 pawn. So now I can't threaten it by playing rook c1 and bishop b3. He's overprotecting it. But this bishop used to guard this diagonal, and now he doesn't. And now if I can double my rooks, then they're really attacking this d7 square, and I'm really threatening to infiltrate in a lot of positions. So I do end up going bishop g5 here, because like he has to make a decision. Like, does he has to think about, does he want me? Does he want to allow me to double his pawns? His king is, weakened because it has an open file by it, but I don't think it's the easiest to exploit actually. And also his so he has to decide if he wants to allow that though, and then he also has to decide where he wants it to go, and that's also kind of tough. Like for example, do you go knight h5, or do you go knight d7, which was what he did in the game? Um, well, now this bishop does a really great job of guarding the d8 square, so he cannot oppose my bishop. And just to rewind a bit earlier, I think instead of bishop e7, I think he could have gone bishop d7. It kind of looks a bit scary, but I actually think maybe if the game progressed something like this, if he allows me to take the knight and double his pawns, I don't think it's the easiest thing in the world to attack his king. And now he opposes he opposes the control of this file. For example, maybe even this. It looks a bit scary to open up your king so much, but maybe this is the way to go to kind of try to simplify and get into an endgame where maybe it's not so bad for you. I'm not sure. But in the game, it's much, much worse than this. So, so he plays bishop b7, and he ends up going knight d7. And that gives me enough time to start doubling my rooks. Like I said, my moves are very, very easy and simple. I just have a very pleasant position. And he goes knight b6, and I thought knight b6 was very weird. He moves the knight out of the way, so now the queen guards e7. So if h6 occurred, I might even just go bishop e7 and bishop d6. That's definitely an option. I'm not sure if that's the option I would choose, but it is definitely possible. So the knight moving, however, prevents bishop e7 in the first place. So that might have been part of his idea, and also attacks the bishop. And in this position, I did definitely consider rook d1, rook a1, giving up the bishop pair, and now my rooks are already developed, and I'm about to infiltrate. But I thought to myself, like, I don't know, like probably queen check and bishop a6, and I was like, is this really better than the alternative? And if these queens ever trade, like this, the opposite color bishop ending is very drawish. So I did think about just doubling the rooks though, but I decided against it. I want to keep both of my minor pieces on the board. I mean, just look at these bishops compared to this knight and bishop. Like, my minor pieces are definitely better than his minor pieces. So I want to keep them on the board if possible. Like, this bishop completely restricts this knight, especially with this pawn as well. So I was definitely very, very happy after he played knight b6. It just feels like, my play is just so easy and natural and beautiful, harmonious, I would even say. He's up going h6 now, just kicking my bishop off of the defense of this diagonal, and he just fully kicks it out. He kind of extends his pawns pretty far, but it's hard to find any moves. Like, now since he kicked off the bishop, you could oppose the file now, but honestly, any endgame, like, these pieces still suck. But maybe trading everything off could be the way to go. Like, trading off both of the rooks, like with something like this. Like, maybe this is the way you try to survive. You try to limit your opponent's counterplay by trading as many pieces as possible. This definitely would have been interesting for him to try. But he didn't do this. Instead, he goes king h7, which allows the f pawn to move, but I'm not really sure what it really does. So maybe just opposing the rook on the d file, the rooks, trading off the rooks on the d file. Maybe that's the way to try to draw this game, or try to defend, I should say. But instead, king h7, it feels like a step in the wrong direction. And as of right now, you're not threatening f5 because I would just take. So, oh, I will note, yeah, after I doubled rooks, now he cannot go rook d8 because I'm just gonna take twice and take this e pawn at the very minimum, and my queen blocks out his queen's access to this file, his queen from infiltrating very well. Anyways, so he can't oppose the rooks now, so he missed his moment. Instead of so he goes rook e8, just over protecting this e5 pawn, and so he's freeing up his queen. But now I centralize my queen and attack more of his pieces by going queen c5. And of course, he would love to be able to go knight d7, but my two rooks on this open file guard this square very nicely. And that's where you're going to see, like, this knight was kind of stuck on b6 because it prevented the rook infiltration. So instead, so he just tries to trade queens, which is a good idea, because if I do accept the queen trade, this endgame is probably still better for me. I mean, just because of how much these suck. But with queens off, it's probably harder to prove an advantage. But it's still definitely doable, probably. Okay. Like, probably after the queen trade, maybe bishop f2. Threatening in a fork. And maybe you want to take the pawn, take the knight, potentially. Maybe. Like, maybe something like this. I'm not really sure. King g7, just defend the f7 pawn. Like, maybe this is... Yeah, maybe black is holding just fine here. I'm not 100% sure. Okay. But I do not take the queen trade because I think queen a5 is significantly better. I'm tickling the pawn, and he cannot push it, of course, because the knight would be free. And he cannot move the knight to c8 to guard the pawn because with the rook infiltration again. So he goes bishop c8, which makes a lot of sense. Guarding the pawn with his queen, and maybe preparing bishop e6 potentially. But now I go rook d6. So the bishop was guarding the c6 pawn, but by moving it backwards, now he is not defending that pawn. And now I'm attacking it. So very, very simple play by me. Very simple and straightforward. And he plays f5. I'm not really sure what you do here. Like, as black, this position just feels losing. Like, what other move do you make? Queen c7, for example. Well, that would drop the e pawn. And we're threatening to move the rook with a discovered attack on the queen. And, like, maybe f6, just to try to hold everything together. Maybe this was what he should have done. It's very, very scary. But your bishop and your knight guard the d7 square pretty nicely. And white isn't breaking through. If he played f6, I might have gone bishop f2. This might have been what I go for. I'm threatening the pawn, and I'm threatening to win the pawn, I should say. But maybe he goes queen c7 now, and maybe this is okay. And maybe I attack, but he can defend. Yeah. So I'm not sure. This might have been a more trying attempt. Just play f6 and accept that your pawns are kind of bad looking, but maybe you can hold on for much, much longer. Instead of the rook d6, he plays f5, but this is not good because it allows me to take the c6 pawn, and now I'm going to double on the 6th rank, and it's going to be devastating. So he takes the pawn, and now I double up, and if he takes another pawn, well, it's actually going to be checkmate in 2 with the rooks and the bishop, the sniper bishop. So after he takes the first pawn and I double up, he goes bishop f5, guarding the square. And this bishop is doing double duty, guarding the e6 square and guarding the g6 square. If the bishop wasn't here, then I could disconnect the queen and rook from the defense of the e5 pawn. So that's why in this position, I play a natural move, but a very, very good one. Pawn takes e4, forcing the bishop off of the defense of one of these two squares. I throw in this check first, and then I take. Because now, of course, if he, moves the bishop off of this diagonal, I just have checkmate. And if he takes, which is what he did in the game, now I can move this rook to e6. It's important not to do this rook because he could take this rook, and if I take his queen, he has 2 rooks for the queen, which is not what I want. So that's why I go rook c e6. And now I'm going to take this pawn next after he moves. And I play bishop takes e5, and he resigns the game. Because you're either going to lose the queen, or you move your king backwards, and now it's checkmate immediately. So I was very, very happy with this game. It's a very, very simple, straightforward game. But, you know, I got a good position out of the opening with this move d6. Definitely not the critical way to play. D5 is better, or taking the pawn on e4 is better than d6. So I got this pleasant position. I think he probably rushed it with c6, is my guess. Not 100% sure. And I just had this very, very pleasant position. And, you know, it's still probably not winning. I'm just slightly better until he starts making a couple weird moves. Like knight b6, it wasn't good. But maybe even bishop b7 was a step in the wrong direction. And king h7 was maybe the last moment where he was going wrong. But honestly, even here, I feel like it's hard for white to break through in this position. If he just goes f6. I don't see it immediately. Maybe I go bishop f2 still, and bishop c5. Maybe that's the play. Like, maybe there's something like this. But with the bishop on c8, now he can go knight d7 more easily. So I'm not 100% sure. Oh, wait, the knight's pinned. Oh, knight's pinned to the queen. Okay, so it gets pretty tricky, admittedly. Yeah, admittedly it gets pretty tricky. So maybe white is still clearly winning, but it probably would have made me think more in the game if he played f6. But anyways, I love the way I converted this position, and it's definitely a feel-good game for me, especially with some of my recent tough games. Admittedly, those are game in 90 plus 30 second increment per move. So these are much, much shorter games, like less than half the length of the games from the Pan Ams. But overall, I'm very happy with this game, and subscribe for more content like this, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.